Yes, shall I start? Well, I hope you enjoyed the film. Our aim was to show the sort of arc of character from someone starting off in a career, somebody perhaps becoming, perhaps starting off not very well, and then perhaps getting a little bit overconfident, and then perhaps getting to a point where they became disillusioned. But I will address one question that I always get asked, which is, what's he doing now? Well, he still lives, he still drinks too much, and smokes too much dope, but he's apparently, last I heard from him, he was in Ukraine. He's done a lot in Syria. He very nearly did win the Pulitzer, but he didn't win it, but he was pretty close. So for all his apparent flaws, he has actually been quite successful. So anyway, we've been asked to try and, I don't think it'll necessarily happen, they want us to go and film in Ukraine and carry on, but I don't know, I think 15 years with one freelancer is quite a lot. But in a sense, what we hoped was that it would represent the sort of underbelly of conflict reporting. The public don't see people like Robert King. They see people I would describe as brand representatives for news organisations that are normally corporate entities. And the way that news is organised, if you work for a television station, say the BBC or CNN, and perhaps some of the ones here, if you're a reporter, the expectation is you are also part of that brand. And it's quite interesting. The vast majority of news organisations are corporations. And these corporations seem to be the chosen vehicle for delivering our news. Perhaps, I would maintain, that they're not perhaps honest about where this material always comes from. The material that we as freelancers delivered was very rarely credited. The content that people like Robert King deliver, we just don't know there are people like Robert King around, and there aren't that many. But they exist. For me, there's a very telling line, and that is when Robert's wife, Olga, who I think he was very lucky to find, rather a tolerant woman. What music's that? Anyway, is when Olga explains that she's slightly baffled by the risks that her husband takes, because no one's really listening. And I certainly felt that, and a lot of my friends feel that in a sense, it can be frustrating when you go off and risk your life feeling that you're doing something that's in the public interest to inform the public, and I certainly believe the public must see some of these images. They may be hard, but we're going to certainly have a lot more war if we think it's an acceptable form of solving problems, and most of us in the world don't think it is. And if we don't understand the reality, the raw reality. I mean, there's something about conflict that I've learned when you read the news never really tells you about it. You hear, maybe you read a statistic, 100 people got killed. Well, what does that mean? How do you actually measure it? What does that mean for an individual? And then there's 100 of them, but there's not 100 of them. They have families, people have relatives. Some of the saddest images I ever filmed were in Kosovo of sort of internally displaced people on the mountainside, in the cold, with the whole family, an extended family, living under a plastic sheet in the winter, with the soggy mattresses, the babies invariably getting ill and dying, the old people dying, and then the men who felt responsible for looking at their families incapable of doing so. And it's not a pretty sight, and you just have to question whether that sort of thing is the way that we should be conducting our affairs in the modern world. And so, in a sense, I think that the sacrifice made by journalists to report that is important, even if people don't switch on. That's their fault, and we still have to do it. For me, it's a bit like the First World War. You've got to go over the top. We've got to do our job as journalists. And sure, we must try and make it engaging and get people involved, but it's just not good enough to say, well, they don't want to watch. That's their problem ultimately. Anyway, that's a perspective. But anyway, Robert is a story we don't see, and I trust Robert more for all his flaws, because I know them and I know him, and I trust his journalism more than I trust a lot of people who have very good, well-paid jobs. Because when I see them portrayed by their news organisations as their brand representatives, we don't get to know them. We get to know what the news organisation, and perhaps these quite often egocentric people, would like us to see about them. And they end up as two-dimensional characters, not people. And are they people we should trust simply because they have a job? Or should we not expect that they should be more self-critical and perhaps explain and justify what they do more? Anyway, I leave that out as an argument, and I probably said enough. What do we do from now?
Well, I don't know whether I have to agree or disagree with you, because we and a friend of mine here from AP might think that our agencies were credible, and we were credible when we were working in the same areas, right, Vaughan?
I wouldn't suggest not credible. I would suggest that very commercial. I would suggest that we need, as journalists, to be more self-critical. And actually, journalists are normally pretty bright. Most journalists don't disagree with me, but they still don't do it.
Yes, but I see that, well, from your point of view, you are very journalistic. Criticize everything, including journalists, right? And their job, and question that as well. And
yes.
You were, yes, well, that's my take.
I think that's right. I think it's essential. I think that we're in an age which is being overtaken by public relations, PR. It's interesting, I was speaking to somebody today who said they were running training for PR people and journalists, and there are a few more PR people than journalists being trained, which is very interesting. In my country, it's much worse than that. In my country, there is very many times as much money spent by governments, corporations, public bodies, all sorts of people on public relations. Well, public relations is designed to promote one side of an argument. It's not enough. And without a really strong journalistic community trying to balance that information, the public are simply being misinformed. And I would argue being badly misinformed, particularly in the internet age, where our business models are collapsing, where we're clearly going to have, in my country, perhaps where we are here is in a slightly different place, but you're probably going in the same direction. We know who are we actually going to have left? The Guardian, the BBC, Channel 4, but some of these newspapers aren't going to exist. And they can't survive because their advertising revenue has dried up. And so, consequently, I think we live in a very dangerous world where a corporation that might have a product that hasn't properly tested can simply send out a press release, backed up by a clever PR agency, often very much better paid than journalists themselves, who are supposed to be checking this stuff out, and they don't, and they can't have the time. They get 10 stories to deal with a day, not one. Investigative journalism and conflict journalism is very expensive. We're doing less of it. How many news organisations, in the time this film was made, I gather the news agencies like Reuters and AP, of course, have many agencies around the world, or bureaus. The BBC still have, New York Times have, on the basis their business model is the last man standing. But very few. And I think we as the public need to be aware that we are not being served well enough by our journalists, because too many of them are walking off to PR, and we need to challenge them a bit. I think journalism is losing its calling. And I think we're entering an age where if we're going to serve the public, we need to look at why we're doing this, and I think we need to refine why we're doing it and refine our commitment and our determination. And sometimes that takes courage, and I think that's what we should be promoting. I'm rather evangelical about this.
Well, there is so we sometimes laugh, like journalists. If we can laugh when we pretend that or disguise ourselves, so we can deceive a person who are working with, and we use as a source. When we do that, can we be sincere with the public?
I'm not quite sure. When you say I think what you're saying is that's war, and it's funny. Yeah.
Yeah.
War is funny. Most things in life that we do contain some element of humour. It's a natural human requirement to survive, to have, I believe, humour, just as you need food. And I find that human beings are incredibly adaptable. You could be in a siege in Sarajevo, you could have been in the situation you were in when the Russians were trying to take half the country over. And you look back sometimes, or other people who are not there might think, oh gosh, that must be awful, but you live it, you get through it, you adjust, And that requires need. I mean, how would you survive a war if you didn't have humour? Of course it's ghastly, of course it's awful. But you ask any soldier who's been there, and very many of them have humour. They have all sorts of other problems. Many of them have PTSD, and a lot of journalists have PTSD. Robert has PTSD. But if you can't laugh at yourselves, then perhaps we take ourselves too seriously in this trade.
It's a different age now. So thank you very much. It's a different age now. And what can you say about citizen journalism? Are they interfering, or is it something like a burden on us, consumers? How do we differentiate?
Well, my view on it is that citizen journalism is very useful. And there's a tendency in journalism, my trade, albeit, remember, I've been a freelancer most of my life. You know, I've slightly been on the outside throwing stones in, but and perhaps that accounts for some of my perspectives. However, what I notice in British journalism is a tendency to feel, and it's wrong, that we're journalists because we work for an organisation that happens to be a news organisation. I think we're journalists because we subscribe to certain ethical values and try to maintain them, and they're actually very basic, and we don't really disagree about them. It's about trying to tell the truth, it's trying to be accurate, it's trying to be fair. We get a bit confused when we look at balance, because sometimes we know that we shouldn't be balanced, and sometimes we think we should, and we can debate about that, but the essentials about it being in the public interest are safe. And I think anybody who's doing that, they can be a citizen journalist. They may not necessarily have the full range of skills, they may be learning them. Where I think the failure is in the news industry. We are not promoting to these people our ethics, and yet we see our own industry diminish. And I wonder whether we care more about our jobs than journalism. If that's our approach, I think what we need to be doing is saying, yes, you too can be a journalist, you can join this club, you can be part of this, but there's expectations. You have to try to find the truth, you have to act in the public service, you have to do all these things. And I think journalism exists in a state of fear in my country. We're worried about our jobs, we're worried about being killed, we're worried about the fact that our industry seems to be in decline. And what we're missing is that actually we should be in this industry, I believe, because we believe in serving the public, ultimately. We're public servants, and I think we're terribly important ones. And I think we're reaching a point whereby our democracies are in real jeopardy. Mine certainly, I believe, is. I think the American one is even worse. I wouldn't profess to comment on yours, I don't know enough about it. But we're essentially, I believe, seeing in this degradation of journalism a failure to inform the public, and I do not see how the public can maintain their own interests and vote properly and conduct themselves the way they are told to by our government, who perhaps they don't really mean it. Have I answered that?
Do you know where the solution is? Could be there a balance between, let's say, the citizen journalism and the professional journalism. We can't be all professional journalists.
Teach by example.
Well, I remember my time, around about these times when we were doing this. We didn't really have the internet, so we couldn't promote ourselves. We were reliant on the news industry, and they screwed us again and again and again. I mean, the reality is, not everybody is very nice in our industry. I've always found, and I run a club for journalists in London, and I really find the best people in the world are members of that club. I mean, the best people are journalists that I know, and some of the worst. And it's very invigorating. But no, I think the solution, if there is one, is I think we need to look at other models. We can't just have commercial models. I think there's a real fight, which I'm sure will lead on to other things, over the internet. The battleground of the public interest is in the internet. You look at Edward Snowden, you look at Julian Assange. Essentially what is happening is those who can, those very powerful companies in this world, are weaponizing the internet, and they have chosen to spy and monitor their own people rather than protect their own people's privacy. And this is really interesting. Where this is going is very dangerous, because if we lose the internet, I really wonder, because the internet turned out to be a very good way of monitoring us. And yet it had such promise. It was going to enable peoples to talk to each other. It was enable all sorts of communications to happen that could have promoted a much better world. But actually, it's not actually happening the way we want it. And I think there are great dangers, and we need to fight for it. And I think journalists, we need to fight PR. we need to come back and say, no, it is, it is not acceptable for a government to spend money on PR in the way they're doing so, to deceive their populations. That's what they're doing. I'll give you an example, a classic example, and that is in Afghanistan. I've been there many times, quite recently, over the last 5-6 years. I was a soldier once, and I'd gone and filmed with my old regiment in Afghanistan on the front line. And the British Army have 200 press officers, and they are there to manage the news. They're not there to give us access. They're there to promote the war to the public. And they're there to make sure the war is sanitized. They will not let you show human suffering. If you cannot show human suffering and link to war, then the general public are hardly going to appreciate the sort of thing they're voting for. The fascinating thing is how current it is. And you only look at what's happening in the Crimea today and the manner in which Russia has been able to do this. And the West is doing nearly nothing about it. This wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. 20 years ago during the Cold War, we would have done something about it.
You can blame that on the PR technology.
Oh yes, you can. Ultimately, you can. It's all part.
I mean, in that.
Well, no. Let me address that. I would present to you this is all part of a sort of militarized West who's engaged in failed conflict. Your country has supported it just as mine has, though with fewer people and hopefully fewer casualties. And the way this has been promoted to the public in such a way that the politicians got voted in again. These policies continued. And actually what we've been engaged in supporting, and these PR companies are supporting, is a sort of cartel capitalism, where you can compare the oligarchs in Russia and you can compare the businessmen who run the politics in America. And you cannot say they're like for like, but they're in the same place. There's a difference of degree only. And this is the modern world, and I'm afraid it's all about business. And the West is simply not prepared to lose a percentage on its growth product to basically try and make a better world. And this is a terrible thing. And yes, it has got to do with PR. We are, the public aren't angry about it. The public are completely docile about it. And they are so because we are fed a line by a government that is not being challenged enough by journalists. I would maintain it. I can't believe it's any different here.
So maybe not everyone knows, but you, as you mentioned, Julian Assange yourself, so maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. You were the one who supported him, in fact. The entire club and the club members supported you, whether they agreed or not. This is your quote, I think. Well, not exactly, maybe.
Yeah.
But what you wanted to say, was that something very specific from your side? You definitely send the message to lots of people, right? By supporting Assange, who was not in the West, in the best situation, or was in the worst ever situation. What do you think about his WikiLeaks and the way he spread, they poured the information, which are sort of private information as well?
I would question whether it was private. I would say if the government owns information, we all own it, and there are governments. But actually, you've asked about 5 questions, and I no doubt you'll have to ask some of them again, because I'll try and address it, because it is quite complicated. And you're absolutely right in saying that Julian Assange has been very controversial, particularly in my country where he stayed. And at first he was the darling of the press because he had all this information and we all wanted it, and not untypically for the British press, we all turned on him. Well, we didn't all. I certainly haven't, and I don't expect to. A lot of people who were close to him betrayed him in many ways, and I'm not angry with those people, I'm not complaining about those people. I think we're all entitled to comment on this from our perspective, and I have a perspective too. Our intervention, and my wife and I, was slightly accidental. It was a series of very small decisions. He came to the Frontline Club, and he was the biggest man in the news, and we absolutely wanted him at the Frontline Club because the journalists wanted to interview him. And he stayed for about a month or 2, and then he went to Sweden, which I'm sure he regretted, and then he came back, and his things started to fall apart for him in many ways. Our intervention was in court. He had been in prison for 10 days, and he still wasn't charged. He had had all sorts of things, and it's very complicated, but I'll try to keep it quite compact. But it came a moment whereby, in court, the judge was persuaded that he should have bail. I'm not in the legal system where you have bail. It's a sort of Anglo-Saxon thing. Bail understood as a...
Yeah, absolutely.
And I believe, I think most of us would believe, that bail is a very good thing. It is very hard to defend yourself from prison. Your lawyers don't have access to you. And if you're not charged with something, bail is an appropriate thing. And if the judge says it is, it is. And the judge was persuaded, except they couldn't find a suitable place for him to go in the course of which I was in the court. And it just seemed, it occurred to me that here was a man that was in such focus, such public focus. I mean, he must be one of the most recognisable people in the world. It was essential that he had the same quality of legal policy and treated by the law in the same way. And I didn't believe he was. He was being misused journalistically. The journalists were doing what there is an inclination, if we're honest, to do. And they were colouring the story in. He was a fugitive. Well, they all knew he was in the Frontline Club. They all interviewed him there, but he was still a fugitive. And it was all coloured in, and it all looked good, and it was all a story, and it was made more dramatic than it was. And all of this was having an impact on the legal process because it was impacting the judge's ability to give him bail because he's a fugitive. He's going to run. Well, that's what the press was saying. And the judge, these guys, this was a junior judge. He didn't want to take a risk. With the most dangerous man in the world. So, he had to have a pretty secure place to have bail, and I was the only person in the court who had it. I have a farm in Norfolk. He could have some piece from journalism, and in a sense, I offered it. And I remember texting my wife saying, "Are you okay with this?" And she kind of sort of said, "Yes." And we, if I'm honest, I thought it'd be 3 months, and it turned out to be 13 months.
1 week.
Yeah.
So you agreed to 1 week.
And I would be lying if I wasn't to admit that it was very difficult for us because he had 20 of his favourite people who had come through our house, and it was hard. And the people at the Frontline Club, who we believe very strongly in the Frontline Club and worked very hard for it for 10 years, and half of them thought that he was the best thing because this journalism was very important. The other half thought he was a rotter. And so, and to be honest, I've always found it important to respect both of these views because I have my views, but I have one brain, and they have a brain, and their brains may be better than me. And actually, I do believe that agreeable disagreement is an incredibly important thing. But clearly we had a role. I mean, the most disappointing thing about this was I thought I had the best story, and I'm a journalist too. And it took me some time to suddenly realise that actually I had a different role, and you can't really do journalism on your guests. And so it was very disappointing, obviously, because I could have had a very good, strong story. But in the end, we kind of got used to it, and it was very tough. And we knew all the journalists covering the story. It was quite funny because we had the really senior New York Times guy in London who we knew, a guy called John Burns, creeping around our garden, putting his nose to our window. And he didn't need to do that. He could have rung us and said, "Hey, can I come in?" And we'd let him in. But it was a much better story to creep around our garden. And so it was very strange being on the other side of journalism. And I have to say, it did develop a certain scepticism in our trade. And I love journalism, but I pity those people who are really hammered by it. And particularly, there's a tendency in my country, and possibly here, you go to someone and you say, "You must speak to us, we're the press." And I believe that's right. And then they do, and we destroy it. And it's very interesting to compare Snowden, who hasn't really been in the press, and he hasn't been really knocked about. I'm sure he would be, if the press would get their teeth into it. And I'm not even saying the press ever really get it wrong. I'm not even saying some of the criticisms about Assange don't have some merit. My issue is, I'm not perfect, and what is it about, and maybe you guys are.
Nobody's perfect.
Indeed, and what is it about the idea that we expect people in public life to be perfect? Because we can't. I mean, I was speaking to a very interesting guy who spent a lot of time with East European dissidents, and he was saying, blimey, they were hard work. Most dissidents, to have the character to stand up to an oppressor, and perhaps even risk your family, risk yourself, risk all sorts of things, risk everything, you really don't necessarily have to be a nice guy. And they weren't necessarily. And yet, we need something, somehow the public needs our people to be perfect, and he's not perfect, and we're not perfect. But there's another fact. I had a grandfather who, when he found that I was bullying smaller children at school, he ticked me off and he said, "That's just terrible. You mustn't do that." I was young, but I was obviously a bully at school. And he said, "If you always choose the weaker side is a more honourable thing to do. You know, go and defend, you know, and in a sense, at the time, that changed me. I remember feeling really bad about my behaviour as a child. And in a way that informed this, because what you saw with Julian Assange was the really powerful forces going for him. The Americans and the Banks of America and all these people and all sorts of governments had erased desks of PR people, and they were effectively perverting the truth, very effectively. And journalism was not challenging this. They were not challenging it. There are hardly any stories out there from employed journalists about the manner in which information is being manipulated to promote certain views. And in this instance, it was discrediting the man, and some of it was complete rubbish. And it was there for journalists to find. You could find it. There were these people hired and paid much better than us as journalists to discredit him. And they did it by something called astroturfing, which is when you create a fake identity and try and promote opinion online that's completely fake. We started to have our restaurant get very, very bad reviews suddenly. I remember one review was classic. It was obviously written in Nevada or something like that on a computer because, it wasn't somebody visited. Because when you visit a restaurant, you don't stand up and agree with your neighbours that the food is terrible and walk out, do you? I mean, we haven't seen anybody say, the food's terrible here, isn't it? Yes, the food's terrible here, isn't it? They had a complete fake quality. And I don't know, I resented that because I resented the manner in which journalists, many of whom are far more capable of me, were prepared and quite happy to ignore this because the fashion in journalism at the time was to lock the guy. And for me, and I believe my wife, she's agreed in the past, actually this is a really important debate. This is really important. If we are not prepared to hold our governments to account and our security agents to account, I mean, the Edward Snowden is much clearer. On Edward Snowden, you have a situation where the NSA and the British GCHQ are simply not accountable. They are self-appointed, unelected people with vast amounts of power that would make the book by George Orwell in 1984 look like a cakewalk. The power of this metadata is so phenomenal. We can all be tracked. I mean, and then you say, well, that's fine. It's against terrorists. Well, we've corrupted the word terrorist. Our mercenaries are now contractors. What is a terrorist? I mean, is it a freedom fighter? What is it? I mean, one man's terrorist is what? And fine, okay, that's complex, but we had a situation where it's very rare in my country to get all the top spies in one room, but as a consequence of Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, they all were in one room as a select committee inquiry. And they admitted then that they were using these tools against paedophiles. Well, we don't like paedophiles, but they're not terrorists. And then suddenly when you unravel all this, you find out that it's also being used against political activists, like Julian Assange, like Edward Snowden. The Occupy movement was the subject of this stuff, and you suddenly realise, hang on, this is unsupervised, it's being used politically, it's very dangerous, and I'm afraid we have to contest this. It has to be supervised. I think there's a problem. It's James Bond. We all watch these James Bond films, and I'm afraid our politicians think these guys are so cool. They think they're wonderful. Well, actually, these guys, these spies, they just like to see you do it through the keyhole. This is what they are. This is the type of people they really are. We can't glorify these people. We have to hold them accountable. I'm not saying that we don't need them. Of course we do. But they're bureaucrats. Like every bureaucracy, they need monitoring. And I'm afraid we need to celebrate people who have the courage. Only today I read that President Obama had decided, apparently, and he's very good at saying he's going to do things and not doing them, or writing speeches to please everybody and doing absolutely nothing, but nevertheless, he did say that he was going to manage this NSA thing differently, make it more accountable. There has been clearly admission that that these spies have not been accountable. And I leave you with this idea: do we really want our spies to be spying on us? Well, you guys were part of the ex-Soviet Union. You know what this means, but far better than we do. We are completely docile in our country because Ian Fleming's a Brit, writing James Bond. We just think that our politicians would never do this. I don't believe they would, this batch. But what about the next lot, or the next lot, or the next lot? Do we really want to arm them with all this power? So no, I think, I've thought about this and discussed with my wife quite a lot. Did we do the right thing? Did we do the wrong thing? And ultimately, we are, personally, my support for Julian has got stronger the more that people have deserted him, because ultimately he needs to be able to make his arguments. Why would the British government spend 57 million, or whatever they claim to have spent, on policing Julian Assange outside the Ecuadorian embassy, and whatever you think of Ecuador, they have given him political asylum, and we have a diplomatic relationship with Ecuador. But further to that, he's not been charged with any crime. Come and speak to him. Swedish politicians are starting to wonder what on earth's going on, and you have a situation where the Swedish Prime Minister on 3 occasions has made statements about the case, about a legal case. So, I'm not saying he is innocent or guilty. I don't know, I wasn't there. But there is something wrong about this, and if we can't see that, then we're blind.
So did the fact that you were a journalist help you to take this decision, I think?
Yes, because I found journalism incredibly rewarding. I love journalism. I found it's given me. It's interesting about one of the things I find most interesting about Robert King is he said in the movie how he was. He felt that if he hadn't found journalism, he would have ended up in a car crash or a drug overdose or drunk too much. And I think that's probably right. For Robert, and I think for me, journalism gives you an assurance that you're doing something of value in life, and I think that's a struggle for many of us. And so I think it can give as well as take. I think it's made Robert, without journalism, he would have no calling, no direction, and he would be a ruined man. So, I think that journalism has helped me, but also I've met so many journalists, I've understood the principles of it, I've seen great journalists at work, and I've tried to imitate those people wherever possible, and so when this has happened, I've been very conscious of the public interest. It did cost me a bit of money. But
yeah, it did cost quite a lot. I just wanted you to promote journalism a little bit, and that's why a little bit provoked you and made you talk about in details about Julian Assange and his support, because I think that majority of us would support him as well.
Yeah.
Well.
But not unconditionally,
of course.
Of course he must be subject to proper journalistic scrutiny, but not journalistic bullying, and I think that's what he's had.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I enjoyed the film, I've seen it, and I enjoyed watching it second time. The first thought that I had when I started watching the film was, in the beginning of the film, we see him, Robert, who is in a way a naive person, who has no idea who is the political leader of the country he's going to, who has no clue what to wear in the war, and it's a person who takes photos nobody likes, right? And you kept filming him for 15 years. What made you to believe in him? His personality? What was that?
Well, we recognised something of ourselves as a group. There was about 10 of us at the moment in the agency I ran, Frontline Television, and over the years we lost half of us got killed, you see, and so we had this. We're very optimistic. We're like the Bang Bang Club, the South African group, who one of them committed suicide, and they were very insular in South Africa and got very depressed by it because of their country they were reporting on. We were able to go around the world. We were quite optimistic, but it was dangerous, and half of us got killed. I got shot a couple of times, and it was a tough time. And I think in Sarajevo we were a bit angry. I was angry. I created Frontline Club out of anger with the traditional news industry because it did nothing to support us over all that time. Individuals did, but the industry didn't. The industry doesn't have the mechanism, I understand now, to do so because we're all sectioned to our little silos, our little corporate silos, are all part of that. There's no real unity or there aren't real institutions. That's one of the things I like about Frontline Club. It is an institution now in London that supports journalism's practitioners on many levels. So we recognised something about why Robert did it. And I think we were just appalled by there had been various documentaries the BBC had recently done. They had a flurry of journalistic documentaries, and they were all crap. And they were all crap because they just promoted journalists as heroes. And it was like straight out the marketing department. And we're not heroes. And we're useful, and we're good, but some of us are very damaged. The type of person who is attracted to this sort of work, and I think is properly displayed now. He's slightly exceptional. I don't think we all had terrible fathers who were drunk and all that, but actually there is damage, and some of the best journalists are the most damaged because they have the motivations and things like that. And I don't think that as an industry we should be promoting ourselves the way we do. I think we should be more honest, and I said that too many times. But with Robert, firstly, he was the only person that let us film him, which was obviously rather cool. But he's very charismatic, terribly flawed. He's quite a good friend. He's a loyal friend. If you're in trouble, he'll be there. He might not be able to help you very much, but he'll be there. And in a sense, he became part of. You know how on one of these places you're driving around and you've got a photographer, you've got this person, you've got that person, you're all contributing to the expenses, and he was kind of one of them, and he sort of under our wing, and we got him that Guardian photo. Because we were doing a story, Richard and I, the other camera, we were doing a story about the manner in which the United Nations soldiers, particularly Ukrainians actually, were running a black market and a prostitution ring in Sarajevo, which is appalling, really. Coming to save the country and then ripping it off, and it was a good story. And then and so we had this sort of opportunity, and he took this photo. But we grow to like him, because you can see the man for what he is. He's not trying to pretend to be somebody else. And he's not as egocentric as so many of the people we've worked with. As a cameraman, we worked with some reporters who were quite dislikable, and we worked with the best people in the industry. Obviously, I've said everything that can be said.
When I was watching the film, I've never been covering your work, and it's very hard. But I wonder, when you are filming, when you are taking photos there, and as Robert mentions, when you see like bodies, you know that it's a head, it's a leg, but you just see the shapes. What do you do to take up, because it's vital in that case, right? How it works?
I mean, I think you learn it. I mean, it's rather like doctors. I mean, I think most of us, if we were a doctor for a day, would faint. But you just get used to it. There is also something, and it's a bit cliche, but it is true. When you're behind your camera, you do have a distance. And I think also, if you're confident, well, there are two things for journalists. If you're getting the best story and you're going to advance your career, then you're going to put up with it, and that's fine. Or if you feel that it's worthy and that it's important. And what I find on stories is, whenever you actually meet people, and despite the fact as a cameraman you can be incredibly intrusive, and you feel awful. There's a burial or something, and there's a real emotion, and people are very upset, and there you are with your bloody camera in their faces, and you kind of feel awful about it. But every time I've spoken to anybody, maybe after, they wanted the world to know, and they want the camera to be there. It has been my experience. Other people have said that it's not their experience.
What is the future of journalism, really?
I think the future of journalism is what we're prepared to make it, and I think that I have personally been incredibly impressed with young journalists in London, actually. I think the generation of young people coming into journalism today realise, first of all, they've made a choice. They're not going to get paid very well. They've made a choice. They're clever people. They could have gone into other jobs. So they made a choice, a moral choice, often. Or they want to go into PR, in which case they sold out, in which case fine. But I think they realise that they've got a really tough job ahead. I think they realise that there's no longer possible to take journalism just as a job. It's got to be a calling. And I'm meeting time and time again. When I talk like I'm talking now, these people love it. And they're very receptive, and they want to talk more about it. And they want to know, how can they succeed? How can they change this? I think they want to hold people to account. I think they've got amazing courage, and I think we're going to have... I see the young... I'll tell you something very strange, actually. For a journalist, I got elected in a small democratic election to be the chair of something called the Frontline Freelance Register. And it's got 400 people on it. And it's amazing, I think, because it's all these young guys and girls who are going into Syria and covering Syria. And you look at their surnames, they're from all over the world. And these people used to be Brits and Americans and Frenchmen, the old Spaniard. Now it's from all over the world. And often it's people where we as journalists have gone and hired fixers, worked with local journalists, and then so a lot of these people have gone and done the same thing. And so it's really interesting to see who's doing this. But the people doing a lot of the really good, dangerous work now are freelance. They've got no money, and they're Roberts. And Robert's been in Syria. He's done some really good stuff in Syria, for example. And I've tried to start with these people, a representative body, because we have to, I believe, freelancers need to fight for a place, a seat at the table in the news industry. We have to actually go out there and say, look, we've got to work together. And we need to ask the news industry in my country to show a bit of leadership, because they show none. There are no common safety criteria, for example, for us to get qualifications that can be recognised so we can employ. It's appalling. Why have the news industry not done this? We've got to engage the news industry and say we want something back. Carve a place for the freelancer, because these are the guys who are going to be running the news industry. And these people are the best hope for journalism being healthy. I mean, not only them, there are lots of bloggers, there are lots of citizen journalists who I think will play a role, and there's the industry, of course, which will always be here. But I think the news industry has to relax a little bit, and it's got to accommodate freelancers, and it's got to work with them better. And I think that is the future. But I believe young people will do far better than we think.
How do you feel? Is the number of freelancers increasing compared to 15 years ago, let's say, or decreasing?
No, it's definitely increasing. And the internet is very much a part of this. And also, it goes in spurts. It depends on the accessibility of the war. Bosnia, you get in your car and you go to Bosnia, you can be anybody. Well, you couldn't go to Iraq without getting beheaded unless you went with the Americans. And they control it. And the Brits control it. So it's very hard. And so there weren't so many. And then, of course, Egypt happened, and Tunisia, and Libya, and now Syria, and of course we've got lots of people again. One of the problems that the freelancers face is, 1 in 3 freelancers is serious, and the other 2 are really not. They didn't have enough love as children or something, or I know their girlfriend left them, whatever it is, they've gone to war zone because it's going to make them more of a man or more of a woman or whatever it is, and that's nuts. Because it's not going to solve any problems at all, but it might create quite a lot. And so in a sense, freelancers find it very difficult to separate themselves from people who are not the same and not out there to do a job. And that's why we tried to create the freelance register as a way of people saying, publicly, no, I'm serious, I want to be part of this, I'm prepared to accept rules, we have rules, we have ethical rules, and we have safety rules, and it requires people to be serious to meet those criteria. And we've got 400, but there are over 1,000 out there. We've got a question about that.
Question about the film again. When you first initially decided to make a film about Robert, what was the initial idea? How long you wanted to follow him? And what was the vision of your film? And how would you see the ending of the film? What was the, let's say, initial idea about the film? If you had any synopsis or outline or the little paragraph about what was the message of the film? How you would see it from the beginning?
Well, at first we wanted to make a story about journalism because we felt that journalism, was doing these terrible documentaries about itself. Then we ended up wanting to film Robert because he was the only person that would be filmed by us, and we thought we could, through him, in some senses, tell our story as well, because he was quite like us in many ways, a bit more drunk, but and then we thought we cut something after Sarajevo that was much funnier. It was really funny because he did lots of other silly things. And got himself into trouble like everything he did was with, it was only in Chechnya that he really learned and grew up in a way. And anyway, we made this comedy, this war comedy, I guess, journo war comedy, and we managed to sell it to Switzerland, and no one else, nobody wanted it. It didn't fit anywhere. Well, it wasn't going to fit in the traditional news industry's view of journalism, and so I believe that was partly why it didn't fit. And also, at the time, television wanted things in series. They wanted things that fit with other things, and it didn't fit with anything. So we weren't able to sell it, so we put it on the shelf and carried on. And then we had some interest. Somebody said, look, it's great, but do you want to carry on with him? Somebody who never obviously bought the film from America and NBC. And so we thought, well, we went out to film again, and we came into the election, which one of the reasons I didn't know anything was I'd just arrived. But Richard insisted we put that in. Anyway, we went to Chechnya, and then we had to follow it because we realised it was going to be different in 5 years' time, and so we carried on. But we have not sold it in America. We sold it in most European countries, and in America it just hasn't worked, and nobody wanted it. And again, it doesn't fit, and we weren't prepared to agree to the way they wanted to edit it. To show it there. So ultimately, I think we were motivated by a desire to show a different face on journalism, and in a sense felt that if we showed freelancers being human, it was rather a good way of being a little bit honest about ourselves as well. most freelancers can see a little bit of themselves in that. You know, you don't do this normally. It's got, you know, you can have a journalistic career where you don't get shot at. You know, it's a strange thing to do in many ways, I think. Have I answered your question?
Partly. Well, I was actually, well, thanks for the answer, but I was actually concerned, well, my question was about if you had a vision of how you would end the film, and when you decided that, well, okay, this is the end, well, I'm going to stop shooting.
The money ran out.
Thanks.
It was as basic as that. I mean, the way we were funding this as freelancers in Sarajevo, we were doing okay because we cut the market. In Chechnya, we couldn't really find a story, so we didn't make any money from that trip. And in Iraq, it was a terrible trip. Nothing really happened, and you saw. So, in a sense, we rather hoped we could sell some stories. I mean, the way I used to work, and most used to work at the agency, was we'd try and get a job as a cameraman with a news agent, you know, a BBC or something like that, or Channel 4, and we'd look after one of their reporters in a war zone, and then we'd stay out there because our flights had been paid, we got some money, and then we'd try and do the stories we saw it, or a different story, and then try and sell it. And it didn't work out for us, so it came to the end. And we lost quite a lot of money on the film, but we're still glad we did it.
No more questions? So, time to we really talked to one of the most interesting people. I was asking just a couple of questions to you, which maybe you didn't like, but I wanted you to show your inner side, which is incredibly interesting, and I would be happy if half of the journalists would question so many things you question.
Well, thank you very much for a generous interview and a generous description. And it's great to be here, and I've really enjoyed speaking to you all. And thank you for asking questions.